There are a lot of ideas that float around about how quickly our energy system can change, but it's a massive system. When you look at the scale of the energy industry and the long lead times, you realize that this is not an industry that changes quickly. And so when you look out to 2030 or so, you see that the world will probably be using a lot more energy. But contrary to what many people think, the mix won't be too different. It will still be dominated by oil, natural gas, and coal. Something very dramatic happened in world oil in 2004. We left behind the world of $20 oil, and we entered the world of $100 barrel oil. Now, with a lot of volatility, that you can see how the price can be lower, you can certainly see it be higher. But what happened in 2004? It was a recognition of the impact of the emerging market countries as markets and what their demand would be, and that world oil demand would shift from the growth in world oil demand would shift from the traditional industrial countries to these emerging markets. And I think that has carried us into a new higher price plane. What I see going on is a great bubbling of innovation all across the energy spectrum. I'm quite convinced that somewhere in different places, people are working on things or will put things together. And that's what happened with shale gas. Different technologies were put together that will, in 10 or 20 years, or maybe even sooner, surprise us. In terms of what we see unfolding right now, I think a big question mark is how far does the shale gale, this unconventional gas revolution, spread to the rest of the world? And what does it mean for oil? Because, the news story is shale gas. The new news story is what's happening with what's called tight oil. And if that spreads, that starts to change the outlook as well. I think there are three big geopolitical stories going on in energy today. Number one is the development of oil resources in the Western Hemisphere. Canadian oil sands, tight oil in the United States, the Brazilian pre-salt. If you add all that up and they continue on a reasonable course, you see a Western Hemisphere that's importing a lot less oil from the Eastern Hemisphere, from the Middle East, although today the major source of U.S. oil imports is Canada, but in general you see less coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. So that's very interesting because it means the Middle East looks increasingly to the East, to Asia, to those emerging markets as its markets. And that clearly starts to have a geopolitical influence. So that's number one. The second big geopolitical question about energy is the U.S. and China. And there are issues like the South China Sea, which are very potentially dangerous. And there's a tendency in some circles to say that the U.S. and China are inevitably rivals for oil. I don't really see it that way. I see they have common interests as consumers. They have common interests in stable markets. And there are tendencies, there's nationalism, there's always concern about, this is the larger question, China's growing role in the world and how those relations happen. So I think it's very important to work on this dimension of the U.S.-Chinese relationship so that it is positive and constructive and doesn't become a source of contention. And the more these issues can be seen as commercial and not strategic, and I think the Chinese are more competent about their access to energy, the better off everybody will be. The third major geopolitical arena is the classic arena. It's the waters of the Persian Gulf and the countries around it. And I think in 2012, we are going to see that Iran's continuing progress and forward motion in its nuclear program is going to continue to raise tensions. And the response is embargo from Europe on Iranian oil, sanctions on the Iranian central bank. And so I think we are going into a higher level of tensions and concern, and it's focused on the Strait of Hormuz, but it's really the entire arena. And I think, you may do an outlook for oil prices, but there are a lot of conditionality in it. One is global GDP, and the other's what happens in the Gulf, what happens with Iran's nuclear program, and the overall continual unfolding of the Arab Spring, which is now going to be more like a decade.